Hi, good morning guys, thanks for joining me. Hope everyone's well, hope everyone's had a nice new year. Absolutely stunning day today down here in the woods. A little bit cool and breezy, but I'm sure we can cope with that. So I thought we'd do in today's video. I had a nice email sent from one of the subscribers, a gent called Ron Revels, so I'd just like to thank Ron for the email. He said he was moving from Minnesota down to Montana, so I hope that move's gone well for you, Ron. And the idea behind today's video, he asked if we could talk just a little bit about basic leatherworking tools, the kind of things just to put a small kit together, the kind of things which I like to use, you know, the kind of places where you can get them from. So what I've done, I've actually just brought out the kind of tools, not everything which I use, just like I say, just to start off, just a basic kit. I've just put them just in a couple of small little bags here, and I thought we'd run through them. So just before we actually run through the tools themselves and get into the nitty gritty, I just thought I'd just run through a few of the items which I've recently made. And again, when it comes to making things out of leather, all the tools which we're going to run through today is going to make all this kind of work possible. So anything from the most basic little sleeve or little slip pouch for things like the augers, that kind of thing, to ferro rod holders and new axe masks. Again, the beauty of it is if you need to replace anything or you just don't like the look of, you know, perhaps a sheath that you've got, there's nothing stopping them from making things, like I say, now they're replacing or just making new things in general. So one of the things which I like to make are ferro rod holders. So it's nice just to keep it at hand and be able to keep it on your belt. And just whilst I've got this in my hand, I'd just like to thank Wade for the ferro rod. An absolutely stunning little Christmas present, so thanks a lot, Wade. Nice little surprise on the post there. And one thing which I've recently made is one of these little sport covers. Now you may think it's a daft idea. I actually saw these on eBay and I thought, you know, why do people want to make them? But I've had one of these recently go through a dry bag, so I thought it's nice just to be able just to keep them points covered up and just be able to just make just a simple little cover for it. All the way to a new axe mask. The ones which come with the Ultifa's axes can be quite bulky. I'm just looking for just something just a little bit slimmer. So again, it just means with the tools which I'm using, I can get these things made. So like I say, the tools which we're going to run through are nice and basic. There's nothing in here which is going to be too technical. But all the tools which we're going to run through means that, like I say, that you can get all these kind of jobs done and make whatever it is that you want to make. So when it comes to doing any kind of leather work, there's usually around about 5 processes which we need to go through. You've got to be able to mark the leather, measure, cut, stick and stitch the leather. So just as long as you've got them kind of tools, which are going to make that job just a little bit easier and also possible, the rest of it really is just down to your own imagination. Them little things which I showed you they're just basic little simple things which you make, you know, do make the odd knife sheath and that kind of thing. And the more you progress and the more you start to enjoy it, you're perhaps going to spend a little bit more on the tools, things which are going to last just a little bit longer, and tools just to make the job, you know, just a little bit easier. But just before I start pulling the tools out and putting them on the cutting board, this is one of the first things which I brought and one of the most important things which I use. And these kind of things you can get from an A4 size. I've actually seen them around about 4 to 5 foot long, and they go from anywhere from about £5 up to £50–60, just dependent on the kind of size what it is that you want to buy. So this one here is an 18" by 12". It does me for the size of leather which I cut. It's also good for sticking things down on. It's also good for dyeing. It's just going to keep the dye off all the other things which you're going to make. Like I was saying, you know, quite an important thing, just a little self-repairing board. It's also got the markers on it for measuring. It's also got lines on it just to make sure that the things that you're going to be cutting are going to be nice and square. So like I said, I just wanted just to show you that just before I start putting the tools on it. But in my opinion, an important part of the kit. So when it comes to doing them first couple of jobs, which is the marking and the measuring, then a lot of this stuff you've probably got hanging around the house anyway. So the rules which I like to use, I just tend to use these steel rules. I've got one there which is 6 inches and a 12". But one thing which I like to do is just make sure that the measurements are in centimetres and millimetres. It's just a little bit more accurate for myself when it comes to marking things which are going to be small. The pens which you can buy, you can actually buy pens or you can buy crayons. You can get specific leatherworking pens, but I just tend to find that these little small, thin, permanent markers work well. Just as long as they're marking the back of the leather, you know, and it's out of sight, you know, they do mark it quite well, and the marks themselves, you know, aren't too bulky. It just makes it just easier to cut to. And then the cutting process itself, you can use pretty much whatever knife it is that you want to use. I just tend to use these cheap little box cutters. Again, you can pick these up from B&Q or Home Base, very, very cheap. The blades come out very easy and easily replaced, and also very cheap, because you do find when you start cutting through a lot of this leather that it does dull the blades down quite quick. And the same thing for any kind of finer cutting. I just tend to use just a finer craft knife. So again, you might have all of this stuff hanging around the house. but if it just comes that you've got to go and buy it, like I say, it's very, very cheap and readily available. Okay, so once you've cut the leather, it's just a case now of sticking it together, and there's various different options out there. One of the preferred glues which I like to use is this Phoebe's leather craft cement, and this is just basically just a PVA glue. Very cheap to buy. I think I paid around about £7 or £8 for this. That's 4 fluid ounces or 118ml. It does work really well. It's easy to clean up and it is quick drying. So I tend just to use that just in conjunction with a glue spreader. The beauty of it is you haven't got to wait for it to start going dry or start going tacky. You just put it just on the edges of the work, just push the two pieces of leather together, and after about 20-30 minutes you can carry on doing your work to it. But one other glue which a lot of people tend to use are the contact glues, so things like Evo Stick, Bostik, them kind of things. Very strong bonding glue, but 9 times out of 10 you're going to be using that, on things which are going to be under a lot of pressure, things like bags, cases, that kind of thing. But for all the smaller projects, this is my preferred glue. Like I say, very easy to use, very easy to clean up. And just whilst the glue's actually drying, just to apply just a little bit of pressure, just make sure that things don't slip away as the glue's drying, and then just tend to use it in conjunction with a couple of these cheap little clamps. And these kind of things again you can pick up from B&Q or Home Base. I think I paid around about £5 for a bag of 10 or 15, all different sizes, and again they hold very, very well. One thing which I just tend to do with them, I've got this kind of diamond shaped marking just on the inside of the jaws there, so I sometimes just make just little paper inlays, just folding paper over like so, and then if you're using any kind of softer leather, it just means that the clamps themselves aren't going to mark the leather just whilst the glue's drying. Okay, so if you're happy that the glue had dried, and that would have taken anywhere between 20 and 30 minutes, something like that, the next process is just putting the lines in, just so that we can get the stitching prepared. Now there's various different ways of doing this. I've covered this in previous videos, but one of the main things which I like to use are the wing dividers. Nice and cheap to buy and very simple to use. Or if it is that I need to put a groove actually in the leather itself, then I could always use one of these little grooving tools. I will leave all the links in the description box for all this kind of stuff, because I do get them from various different suppliers and at various different shops and that kind of thing. But again, if you just look on eBay or Amazon, these things are readily available and very, very cheap. So the rough rule of thumb when it comes to putting the lines in the leather, imagine that piece was actually stuck to the other piece. What a lot of people like to do is just measure the width of the two pieces of leather combined, and that's usually then the width for when it comes to marking the leather. So when it comes to using the wing dividers, it's just a case of just turning them just so you can open them up and close them, just to get the width of line that you're looking for. And then it's just a case of just putting one edge just on the outside of the leather, the other part just on the leather itself, and just running that down there. And that then actually just leaves you with a faint line which just runs down the leather. Like I said, I've got the other tool here which will actually put a groove in the leather for me, and again you can actually just set that just by undoing the little grub screw and just pushing that in and getting the right width what you're looking for. And it's just a case just turning it in slightly, just pushing that just down the edge, and as you can see there, that little slither of leather just coming out over the top, and that there is actually just scored just a little line in the leather for us. And again, if you wanted just to keep the stitching just under the leather, that's one option there, but like I say, the majority of the time I actually just use the wing dividers. So once you're happy that the lines are nice and straight, in my opinion, that's what makes neat leather work, is the final stitching. If the stitching looks untidy, then my personal opinion, the leather work itself can start looking untidy. It's now just a case of marking, just actually put the holes in it. So again, there's various different options. I've got a couple of them options here just to show you. And one thing which a lot of people like to use, I don't tend to use them so much myself, is a little pricking wheel. and that's just a very simple device. It looks similar to the spur. It's just a round disc with a load of little spikes which come out of it, and with that you can just run that just down the line which you've actually just put into the leather, and that then will mark a series of shallow little indentations just in the leather. Not sure if the camera is actually picking that up, and then with each one of them single little holes you can then use something like an awl and actually just pierce it just straight through the leather, just following them little marks, and that then is going to make sure that that line is nice and straight. But the option which I like to use, it's quicker and it's easier, certainly for the kind of things which I make, and that's using these little pricking irons. So I've got a few different sorts here. Some of these are purchased as a kit which are brought off eBay, and some of them have actually brought as individual items. So the kind of things which you pick up off eBay, I think I paid around about £5 for that set there, and you've got various different amounts of prongs on each one, so you've got a single going all the way up to the 6 prong. So these kind of things, if you're going to be running quite a long straight series of stitches, you then use the one with the maximum amount of prongs on. If it was that you needed to go around a corner, you then got the option of using either the double or the single. You know, nice and handy to have. One thing which I would recommend doing with them is just getting some very, very fine wet and dry, and just rubbing them just over the wet and dry, because they are quite rough when you buy them, and the idea when you pull them back out of the leather is have them nice and smooth so that they don't actually pluck the leather or cause any kind of damage to it. And the other couple of sorts, these ones here are made by a company called Ivan, and these are just a mid-range price. I think for that one I paid around about £10 for it, and the larger one again I paid around about £12–15, something like that. But like I say, these are the preferred options. And if you notice there's a different size out of the two. There's quite a difference just in the amount of teeth and also the gap in between them. And the idea for that, I'll just give you a close-up here of a couple of axe masks which I've made. So I've just got the camera just to pick up just on the stitching itself. You can perhaps be able to see the difference there on the two masks. One of them, the stitching is quite small, and there's quite a greater number of stitches on that one compared to the other. And the difference being with the two different pricking irons. One of those there is a 3mm, so it means that the stitch itself is a 3mm stitch, compared to the other one there, which is a 2mm. So again, you've just got to decide, you know, what kind of stitching it is that you want. You know, if you're going to be sewing along a piece of leather, and you're perhaps not going to want, you know, a load of stitching on it, so then it just means you can swap and just go over to the longer stitching iron. So when it comes to using them, very quick and very simple. It's just a case of just knocking it through with an hammer. So once you've actually marked your line, like I showed you just on the other piece of leather, it's just a case then of making sure that everything's nice and square, making sure that everything's nice and parallel, and I'm just going to give it just a few hits. And as you can see with that it's actually started just to come through just on the other side. And the beauty about these is once you've got both pieces of leather stuck together, that you can actually knock that both through the front and back, and it just means then that all the lines are married up and the stitching should be quite neat. So once you're happy with the holes, everything's nice and neat, and you've got the holes pretty much punched all the way through, it's now just a case of just sewing things together. So again, just like everything else here, you've got to choose what it is that you can use. You can either go with synthetic threads or you can go with natural threads. Personally, I do like the synthetic threads. They do last a lot longer and they are easier to use. But for tradition, if you wanted to, you could go over with something like a traditional kind of thread. That one there is a nice white coloured thread. But if you do go with the synthetics, you've got a multitude of colours. But again, I do like to use the natural colours, things like the browns, the greens, blacks and that kind of thing. So just running alongside the threads, you're going to have to obviously use some kind of needles. And a lot of people are under the impression that the needles must be very sharp. But when it comes to leather work, the needles themselves are actually quite blunt. So these ones here have been made by a company called John James, and these are Saddler's Harness needles. Two different sizes, and these are the sizes which I tend to use the majority of the time. So I've got a size 002 and a 004. Just be mindful when you do buy your needles and the different sizes, because just like hooks, there's hundreds of different sizes. I think I brought some which are pretty much like a 40 instead of a size 4, and they were absolutely massive. But just give you a quick close look at these needles themselves. And that one there is the size 2 and that one there being the size 4, so you can see the difference just in the length of the needles. There's a slight difference just in the thickness, but like I say, the needles themselves aren't very sharp, they're quite rounded just at the tips, because the last thing you want is actually just drive that through the leather and actually have it embedding in your finger. But again, because you're going to be using all these different tools just to be able to put the holes in the leather in the first place, there's no actual need, you know, to have any kind of severe point just on the needles themselves. And then the little scissors which I like to use are just these cheap little shearing scissors, perfect for cutting the thread, and if you want to get in real close, tight little corners, you can use them in that kind of fashion as well. And then one thing that you always use is wax, whether I'm using it on the awl, whether I'm using it on the pricking irons, or whether I'm using a natural thread like this linen thread here. Again, it's nice just to be able just to slick that up and just to waterproof it just a little bit. And that's what I was referring to at the beginning about the synthetics lasting just a little bit longer. They're going to be rot proof and waterproof, you know, unlike linen thread is. And again, with these kind of threads, you've got a multitude of colours, everything from pinks, yellows, greens, you know, you name it, all the way down to the subdued, more natural colours, the ones which I like to use. Okay, so that's all the smaller items which you could use for the stitching. If it is that you're going to be stitching on your knee, that's going to be perfect. But there's going to be times when you're going to want to work out of your hands. Perhaps you're using 2 needles, something like the saddle stitch. So with that being said, you're perhaps better off buying something like a little stitch pony. I'll just pull the camera back a little bit just to show you. And these stitch ponies you can pick up from Amazon, eBay, them kind of places. I think this one actually comes from Tandy Leather. And again, anywhere from around about £15 or £20. And the idea behind them, you just got this little grub screw, and you just turn that in one direction to open the jaws up, and then turning it in the opposite direction actually then just closes them jaws up. So it's just a case of just popping just your work just in the jaws themselves, and then tightening them up just so that everything is gripped nice and securely. And then that means then that you can use both hands with your needles and do your saddle stitch. And it just holds everything for you, and it's nice and secure. So certainly worth having if you're going to be using 2 needles. If you're just going to be using the single needle, like I was saying, there's enough stuff up on the board here just to be able to do that with. Okay, so once everything's been stitched together and you're happy that everything's nice and neat, really it's just a case of just finishing the edges off. So there's various different ways which you can do it. Sometimes I just leave the edges natural and just wax them, or other times I'll burnish them and just get the fibres really tight, or perhaps I may just dye the edges. So just showing you just a couple of examples. This one here has been dyed with the dark walnut dye. Again, it's just nice and neat, just finishes things off nicely. And then just on this other little ferro rod holder there, I've just used a brown dye. Or like I said, if I wanted to, there's nothing stopping me from just tightening that fibre down there and just leaving it natural. Just adding just a little bit of wax to it, which will darken that down. So again, you know, the choice is down to yourself, but there's various different tools for these kind of things, and this is what we're going to run through now. So a couple of the tools which I like to use are just referred to as an edging tool, and you can buy different sizes of these. And that's those 2 little tools here. Again, very, very cheap. I think this one I picked up for around about £5 or £6 off eBay, and the other one here is a Tandy Leather version, so you're going to be paying a bit more. I think I paid around about £15 for that. And the idea behind it is so you can actually just round off just the corners of the leather. It's just a case of just using just the edging tool, just running it up the edge like so, and that's going to remove one of the corners. And then you can just do it just on the opposite side. I don't necessarily always do it on both sides. And then it just means when you burnish the edges that them corners then will round off and just finish that work off really nicely. So the edging tool itself, or the burnishing tool just to finish the edges off with, I just tend to use just one of these little simple burnishing sticks. You've got different widths there for different thicknesses of leather. So this one here I think is around about 2.5mm, something like that. And then if you wanted to, you could just wet it down, just water, just on a sponge, something like that. And then just using the burnishing stick, it's just a case of just adding friction. Just doing it in small little sections, just rubbing it up and down on the surface of the leather, That then will tighten them fibres down for you, and then that edge will be nice and slick, nice and polished and finished off really well. But if it says that you don't want to use water, you can buy various different things. One of the things which I do use, which is quite good, is this Tragasynth. Again, used just in the same way as what water is. It's just a case of just putting it just on your finger and then just rubbing just a small thin layer just on the leather itself. Just like so, and then using the burnishing stick, just going to create friction and just polish this edge up. And then just after a few minutes, that side there, or that edge, being just the natural edge, just one which I've cut off, and then the other side here is the one which we burnished, and the one which we just run the edging tool up, and that one there is nicely rounded off and nicely polished. And like I say, that fibre now is nice and tight, so there's going to be less chance of actually the water being able to penetrate and soak up into the edge of the leather there. So if it is that you want to dye the edge of your leather, then there's various different things there on the market. So this little feather rod holder here, I actually use just like a paint. You can paint that on. Some people like it, some people don't like it. I don't mind it. The finish is quite well on it. Or if you wanted to use some kind of traditional dye, which is what I've used just on the edge of that other feather rod holder there, then that's the kind of dye which I like to use, which is this Phoebe's Pro dye. Again, available in loads of different colours. I would suggest that you do it outside. It does absolutely stink, but the finish is always very nice, and it does last for a long time. So just the other things which I like to put on leather, this is pretty much when the items are finished, just for proof and also condition the leather. One of those being this Phoebe's mink oil paste. Again, some people like it, some people don't like it. What the mink oil paste will do is actually soften the leather down for you. So a lot of people don't like it for work boots and that kind of thing. Well, you know, if you're going to use it on things which are going to be made out of tool leather, perhaps you just want to soften them up just a little bit. So in my opinion, that's perfect. Or for the times where I just want to condition the leather and add a little bit of waterproofing, I then just made up my own just out of beeswax and coconut oil. So again, you know, the choice is down to yourself. It's only a case of just conditioning, just to stop that leather from drying out, and just making sure that you can waterproof it, just to stop it from rotting away. And again, you know, there's hundreds of different things out there on the market. You know, that choice is down to yourself, really. Okay, so that just brings me on to the last little section, and that's all the metalwork, so things like the poppers and rivets and that kind of thing. And Ron did ask, you know, about these specifically. So when it comes to buying poppers, there's various different sizes, various different colours, you know, so to suit your work, whether that's the size or the colour itself. One of the colours which I do like is this antique nickel. And Ron asked, you know, how can you tell, you know, if it's all made for outdoor use or perhaps indoor use, whatever it may be. You know, my opinion, you know, it all tends to be made for outdoor use. So things like these antique nickel are actually brass, and it's just been coated, so there's no chance from rusting. You know, they may tarnish over time, but they're certainly not going to rust. Just one thing to keep in mind, you know, when you're buying all this kind of stuff. So these, for example, are a size 20. So if these are a size 20, it means you've got to buy a size 20 tool. I will explain about it in a second. And again, when it comes to your rivets, you can buy various different size rivets. So obviously you can tell there those are smaller than the other ones in the other packet. And again, you're going to need a separate tool for each of the different sizes. So when it comes to the poppers and the rivets, you know, it can be quite expensive to start off with, because you've obviously got to buy the tools to set the things with in the first place. So when it comes to the tools, I tend just to use just this cheap and cheerful little punch. And I showed this on the last video when I did a little bit of leather work. So the punch itself is actually just it's called an auto punch. And as you punch that through the leather, it actually carries that little piece of leather just up into the tool itself, so you haven't got loads of little bits knocking around on the board. And it's a nice clean little owl. And when you do buy them, they come with various different size punches. I think they go from 1.5mm up to 6mm. Or if you want to go a little bit bigger, then obviously, you know, you can buy them bigger punches on them rotary things where you actually just squeeze the handle. But for me, you know, that works quite well. So we just punch the owl just in the leather like so. And if it is that you're going to use, let's say, press studs or poppers, one of the tools which I've started using is one of these little sets, and this set itself is made by Tandy. Just show you just the front of the packet there, and that's this snap starter kit. And again, it's got everything from I think the size 16s up to 24s. So we're going to go from 16 up to size 24. And like I say, in these size rivets which are brought are a size 20, which is that size there. And again, if it wasn't for the fact, you know, I've got this little bar with all these different sizes on it, you then have to buy different dies and punches, you know, with all them separate sizes. So the rivets themselves, they come in two halves. You get the back section and then the front section. Thankfully, they always seem to put them in two separate bags. So the back section has got the post on it, which will just come up through the back and through the hole, just like so. And then you just got the little cap, which just fits over the top of it, he says, just like so. And then you just use the back side as an anvil, just place that just on the flat side, and then you just use the appropriate sized little bar, which is that one there, and then it's just a case of just tapping that down and just flaring it over just to stop that from coming off. And the same thing applies just on the opposite side. Again, you've got one side which is front and back, so it's just a case of just pushing the post through like so, and then the cap just on the back, and then it's just a case of just flipping that tool over, and then like I say, that's a size 20, that'll fit in there perfectly. That's just going to grip that and stop it from moving about, and then it's just a case of just tapping that post down again and just flaring it over just to stop it from coming off. The rivet's working exactly the same kind of way, but I haven't got some kind of fancy tool. I've just got a couple of the separate little tools, and again, I just keep them just in a bag like so. And then you've got the two different sizes there for flaring the rivets over. And when it comes to the rivets, there's various different sorts. I tend to buy capped rivets, which means that you've got a cap both on the front and on the back, where I've just got a quick example. That the ones which tend to come on the Ultifa's mask, I've got a cap on one side and they're just flared over on the back. So again, you know, there's various different choices which you can use depending on what you like the look of, depending on the kind of thing, I suppose, which you're going to be making. But like I was saying, just keep it in mind, you know, if you're going to be buying all this kind of stuff, it's not just, you know, a one tool does everything. If you're going to be using different sizes, then obviously you're going to have to buy the different size tools to set the things with in the first place. Okay, so I've just laid the tools out just on the cutting board, just give you a quick recap of the kind of things. So we've got everything here from the marking, the cutting, the gluing, the stitching and the finishing. So everything here just from start to finish, and getting pretty much anything what I want to make really made. And again, you don't have to spend a fortune. I will leave all the links in the description box, like I was saying. Some of this stuff, you know, will get swapped out with better quality stuff as and when I need to. And I'm sure, you know, the same thing applies to everyone. The more you get into it, you swap things out for better quality tools. And again, you know, things like these little stitch irons, like I was saying, this one here, I paid around about £10 or £15 for it. I've actually seen them going up to, you know, around about £100 each. The same thing can apply, you know, for all the edging tools and all that kind of stuff. So again, you know, you don't have to spend a fortune. Just get yourself into it nice and gently. Just make the things that you want to make, and then what tends to happen is you tend to find that you need something to do a job, and then you buy that tool, and then you've got it for next time. So there we go, guys, just a quick look inside the leatherworking kit. That's been a bit of help to people that may be putting a small kit together, and certainly to Ron, who asked about the question in the first place. Hopefully the next video will be out and about. I have ordered a new rucksack, so hopefully that should be here sometime this week. We'll get a little bit of weight put inside it, get it on the back, and we'll get out and do a little bit of a walk. So like always, guys, you just leave me say thanks a lot for stopping by and watching the video. Like always, until next time, you take care, and I'll see you again.